The old wooden fence posts stood like silent guardians along the dirt road, weathered by decades of Nebraska storms but still holding strong. Behind them stretched 200 acres of some of the richest farmland in the county, where corn grew tall in summer and wheat turned golden in fall. This wasn't just any farm. This was the Henderson place, and everybody in town knew the story of how it all began. Back in 1924, a young man named William Henderson stepped off a train with nothing but $27 in his pocket and a dream bigger than the endless sky above him. He'd heard about cheap land out west, places where a man could work hard and build something that would last. What he found was a rundown plot that most folks had given up on. The previous owner had tried to grow crops but failed 3 seasons in a row. The house was falling apart. The barn had a hole in the roof, and the well had gone dry. But William saw something different. He saw potential. He saw home. For months, he lived in a tent while he fixed up the old farmhouse board by board. He dug a new well with his bare hands, hauling bucket after bucket of dirt until he hit water so pure and sweet that neighbors came from miles around just to taste it. He patched the barn roof and painted it bright red, a color so vibrant it could be seen from the highway. And when spring came, he planted his first crop of corn. That first harvest was modest, but it was enough. William married his sweetheart, Dorothy, the following year. She was a school teacher from town who fell in love not just with William, but with his vision of what their life together could become. They honeymooned in the farmhouse William had rebuilt with his own hands, and Dorothy planted a vegetable garden that would feed their family for generations to come. Their first child, Robert, was born in that house during a snowstorm in 1927. The doctor couldn't make it through the drifts, so William delivered his own son, with the help of 2 neighbor women who braved the weather to be there. Robert grew up knowing every inch of those 200 acres. He learned to drive a tractor before he could properly reach the pedals, standing on wooden blocks his father had nailed to the floorboard. When Robert came of age, he took over more and more of the farm work. He was different from his father, in some ways, more willing to try new techniques and modern equipment. But he understood what the land meant to the family. He married a local girl named Betty, and they raised 3 children of their own in the same house where Robert had been born. The farm provided for them through good times and bad. During the drought of the 1950s, when other farms in the county withered and died, the Henderson place survived thanks to that deep well William had dug and the irrigation system Robert had installed. When crop prices fell in the 1970s, they diversified, raising cattle and selling fresh vegetables at the farmers' market in town. Robert's son, David, represented the 3rd generation to work the land. He studied agriculture in college and brought back new ideas about soil conservation and crop rotation. Under his care, the farm became more productive than ever. He modernized the equipment, upgraded the irrigation system, and even installed the first computer in the county to track weather patterns and crop yields. David married his college sweetheart, Linda, and they had 2 children. Their son, Michael, loved the farm life and seemed destined to carry on the tradition. Their daughter, Jennifer, preferred books to barnyard chores, but she still helped during harvest season and understood the importance of what her family had built. As the years passed, the Henderson farm became more than just a place of business. It became the heart of the community. Every summer, they hosted the county fair in their biggest field. Dorothy's vegetable garden, now tended by Linda, supplied the local food bank with fresh produce. The red barn that William had painted decades earlier became a landmark that visitors used for directions. But perhaps most importantly, the farm was where the family gathered. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday and anniversary, they came together in the house that William had rebuilt. The kitchen table where Dorothy had served her first meal as a newlywed was the same table where great-grandchildren now learned to write their names. William lived to see his great-grandchildren born in that house. He was 78 when his heart finally gave out on a quiet Tuesday morning in March. He died peacefully in his sleep, in the same bedroom where he'd brought his bride more than 50 years earlier. The family found him with a smile on his face, as if he'd been dreaming of those early days when he first saw the potential in a rundown farm that nobody else wanted. The funeral was planned for the following Saturday. Family members came from all over the country. Michael drove in from Colorado, where he worked as an engineer but still dreamed of returning to farm the land someday. Jennifer flew in from Chicago with her husband and 2 young children, who barely knew their great-grandfather but understood that something important was ending. They gathered in the parlor of the old farmhouse, sharing stories and looking through photo albums that showed 4 generations of Hendersons working the same fields, celebrating in the same rooms, and growing up with the same values that William had brought to Nebraska all those years ago. Nobody knew that while they were planning William's funeral, planning to lay him to rest in the small cemetery that bordered their property, a mistake was being made in a corporate office hundreds of miles away. A clerical error that would turn their day of mourning into something nobody could have imagined. The Pinnacle Development Corporation had been buying up farmland across the Midwest, converting agricultural property into shopping centers and housing developments. They had legitimate business with a farm 50 miles away, a property whose owner had already agreed to sell. But somewhere in the maze of paperwork and property descriptions, someone had written down the wrong address. Instead of targeting the farm they actually owned, they had accidentally scheduled the Henderson place for immediate demolition. The orders had been signed, the crew had been dispatched, and the machinery was already loaded on trucks, heading toward 200 acres of farmland where a family was preparing to bury their patriarch. As Friday evening fell across the Nebraska countryside, the Henderson family finished their preparations. The church service was planned for Saturday morning, followed by burial in the small cemetery where William would rest beside Dorothy, who had passed 5 years earlier. After the funeral, they would return to the farmhouse for a meal, sharing more stories and beginning the difficult process of deciding what to do with the farm that had been their anchor for 4 generations. None of them slept well that night. Grief has a way of keeping people awake, making them remember every conversation they wished they'd had, every moment they wished they could relive. They had no way of knowing that their sleepless night was nothing compared to the nightmare that awaited them in the morning. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp March air that made everything feel fresh and new. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and if it weren't for the black clothes hanging in closets throughout the house, it might have been mistaken for a perfect spring day. The Henderson family moved quietly through their morning routines, preparing for what they thought would be the most difficult part of their day. Linda stood in the kitchen making coffee for the relatives who had stayed overnight. The same kitchen, where William had eaten breakfast every morning for over 50 years, now buzzed with quiet conversation as family members shared memories and prepared for the service. Jennifer helped her young children get dressed in their Sunday best, explaining as gently as she could why they were all wearing dark colors and why Great-Grandpa wouldn't be coming to any more family dinners. By 9 o'clock, cars began pulling into the long gravel driveway. Neighbors who had known William for decades came to pay their respects. The pastor from the small church in town arrived early to go over the service details one more time. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, the way people do when they're trying to be respectful in the face of loss. The church service was beautiful. The pastor spoke about William's life, his dedication to family and community, and the legacy he'd built from nothing but determination and hard work. Michael stood up and told stories about learning to fish in the pond behind the barn, and how his grandfather had taught him that success wasn't measured by how much money you made, but by how much good you did for others. Jennifer shared memories of summer afternoons spent helping her grandmother in the vegetable garden, and how William would always save the biggest tomato for her to take home. Even the youngest family members participated, with great-grandchildren reading poems they'd written about the farm and the man who had built it. After the church service, everyone drove in a slow procession to the small cemetery that sat on the edge of the Henderson property. It was a peaceful spot, shaded by old oak trees that William himself had planted as a young man. Dorothy's headstone was already there, waiting for her husband to join her. The grass was green and well-maintained, and wildflowers were just beginning to bloom along the fence line. The graveside service began at 11:30. About 40 people gathered around the simple wooden casket, listening as the pastor read from William's favorite Bible verses. The spring breeze rustled through the oak trees, and for a moment, Everything felt peaceful. This was how it was supposed to be, the family thought. A quiet, dignified farewell to a man who had lived a good life. That's when they heard the rumbling. At first, it sounded like distant thunder. David looked up at the clear blue sky, confused. There wasn't a cloud in sight. The rumbling grew louder, and then they could feel it in the ground beneath their feet, a low mechanical vibration that seemed to be getting closer. The pastor paused in his reading, distracted by the noise. Family members began looking around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Some of the older relatives seemed annoyed that something was interrupting this solemn moment. Then they saw the dust cloud. Rising from the direction of the farmhouse, a brown plume of dust was billowing into the clear morning air. The rumbling sound was getting much louder now, and they could make out individual engine noises. Heavy machinery. Lots of it. Michael was the first to react. As an engineer, he recognized the sounds of construction equipment. But why would there be construction equipment on their property? And why today, of all days? "What's going on over there?" he asked his father, pointing toward the dust cloud that was now clearly visible above the tree line. David shook his head, just as confused. "I have no idea. We didn't schedule any work." The pastor tried to continue with the service, but the noise was becoming overwhelming. The mechanical roaring was now so loud that people had to raise their voices to be heard. And the dust cloud was getting bigger. Jennifer grabbed her husband's arm. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "Something's really wrong." That's when they saw the first bulldozer. It came around the bend in the dirt road like a yellow monster. Its blade raised high, diesel exhaust pouring from its stack. Behind it came another one, and then another. Excavators with their long arms and massive scoops. A wrecking ball mounted on a crane. Dump trucks, equipment trailers. An entire demolition crew was rolling onto their property. The family stood frozen around William's casket, watching in disbelief as the convoy of destruction headed straight for their home. The machines were so loud that the pastor had to stop, speaking entirely. Some of the elderly relatives were covering their ears. The children started crying. "Oh my God," Linda whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "They're going to the house." David started running. Still in his funeral suit, he sprinted across the field toward the farmhouse with Michael close behind him. Other family members followed, leaving the pastor and the casket and the peaceful cemetery behind as they raced to protect their home. But they were too late. By the time they reached the farmhouse, the demolition crew was already setting up.
Men in hard hats and safety vests were walking around the property, pointing at different buildings and consulting clipboards. The lead bulldozer was positioned directly in front of the house, where 4 generations of Hendersons had been born. "Stop!"
David shouted, running toward the bulldozer operator. "Stop! This is our house. You can't do this." The operator looked down from his cab, confused but not particularly concerned. He pulled out a work order and waved it at David. "Says here we're supposed to clear this property today. Got all the paperwork right here." "There's been a mistake." David was out of breath from running, his voice cracking with panic. "This is our family farm. My father's funeral is happening right now." By this time, more family members had arrived. Jennifer was recording everything on her phone, instinctively knowing they would need evidence of what was happening. Other relatives were also pulling out their phones, capturing the surreal scene of demolition equipment surrounding their family home while they were still dressed in their funeral clothes. The crew supervisor, a stocky man with a clipboard and an attitude, walked over to David. "Look, buddy, I understand you're upset, but we got our orders. This property is scheduled for demolition today. We got court orders, we got permits, we got everything we need." He pulled out a thick folder of paperwork and started flipping through. "See, right here. Property scheduled for clearing. Shopping center going up here next month." David grabbed the papers and started reading. His face went white. The documents looked official. They had stamps and signatures and legal language that he couldn't fully understand. But they clearly stated that this property was to be demolished immediately. "But this is impossible," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "We never agreed to sell. Nobody ever contacted us about any of this." The supervisor shrugged. That's between you and the lawyers, pal. I just tear things down, and I got orders to tear this down today. Behind them, the bulldozer engine roared to life. Jennifer was still recording as the massive machine lurched forward, its blades scraping against the front porch where she'd played as a child. The wooden steps that William had built with his own hands splintered and cracked under the weight of the steel blade. Please. Linda was screaming now, tears streaming down her face. Please stop. This is our home. But the machines didn't stop. One by one, they joined the destruction. The excavator's claw ripped into the roof where William had fixed leaks for 50 years. The wrecking ball swung into the side wall where Dorothy had hung her flower boxes every spring. Within minutes, the house that had sheltered 4 generations was reduced to a pile of broken wood and shattered memories. The kitchen where Linda had made coffee that very morning. The bedroom where William had died peacefully just days before. The parlor where the family had shared stories and looked through photo albums. All of it was gone. And through it all, Jennifer kept recording. Her phone captured not just the destruction, but the crew supervisor's confident voice as he read from his work orders. It captured the exact moment when he realized something was wrong, when the address on his paperwork didn't quite match the property they were destroying. But by then, it was too late. The Henderson family home was gone, demolished, while its owner was being buried just a few hundred yards away. The dust had barely settled when the Henderson family found themselves facing a nightmare that seemed to get worse by the hour. What should have been a day of mourning and remembrance had turned into something that felt like a bad dream, except they couldn't wake up from it. David stood in what used to be his childhood home, now nothing more than a pile of broken wood and twisted metal. His father's favorite rocking chair, the one William had sat in every evening to watch the sunset, was buried somewhere under the debris. The family Bible that had been passed down through 4 generations was gone. Photo albums filled with memories of birthdays, holidays, and family milestones were destroyed. The demolition crew had packed up and left within an hour of finishing their work. They'd done their job efficiently and completely, leaving behind only destruction and a family in shock. The supervisor had handed David a business card for Pinnacle Development Corporation and told him to take it up with the office if he had any complaints. By Sunday morning, the story had spread through the small Nebraska town like wildfire. In places where everyone knows everyone else's business, word travels fast. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Family Farm Demolished During Owner's Funeral." By Monday, it had been picked up by the regional news stations. That's when Pinnacle Development Corporation made their first public statement. The company's spokesperson, a polished woman in an expensive suit, appeared on the evening news with what seemed like complete confidence. She spoke with the kind of authority that comes from years of corporate training, her voice calm and professional. Pinnacle Development Corporation operates strictly within the bounds of the law, she stated, looking directly into the camera. All of our property acquisitions follow proper legal procedures. We have documentation showing that the demolition of this property was conducted with full legal authority. She went on to explain that the company had followed all required steps before beginning demolition. They had obtained proper permits, filed the necessary paperwork with local authorities, and even had court orders authorizing the removal of structures on the property. While we sympathize with the Henderson family's emotional distress, she continued, the fact remains that this demolition was legally justified and properly executed. We stand behind our crew's actions completely. The statement was accompanied by what appeared to be an impressive stack of legal documents, foreclosure notices, eminent domain filings, court orders, and permit applications. To most people watching the news, it looked like Pinnacle had done everything by the book. But David wasn't most people. He'd grown up on that farm, and he knew every detail of his family's financial situation. His father had owned the property outright, with no mortgage payments for over 20 years. There had never been any foreclosure proceedings because there was nothing to foreclose on. No one from any government agency had ever contacted them about eminent domain. That's when David decided to fight back. He hired Tom Bradley, a local attorney who specialized in property law. Bradley was the kind of small-town lawyer who knew everyone in the county and had built his reputation on taking care of regular folks who couldn't afford big city legal fees. He'd handled the Henderson family's simple legal matters for years, but this was unlike anything he'd dealt with before. Bradley's first step was to examine the documents that Pinnacle had produced. What he found didn't make sense. The foreclosure paperwork showed a mortgage that had supposedly been taken out 3 years earlier. But Bradley had the original title documents in his files, clearly showing that William Henderson owned the property, free and clear. The signatures on the mortgage papers didn't match William's signature on other documents. The eminent domain filing claimed the property was needed for a public highway project, but the State Highway Commission had no record of any planned construction in that area. The court orders authorizing demolition were dated just 2 weeks before William's death, but no one in the family had ever been notified of any court proceedings. Most suspicious of all, several of the documents had dates that had clearly been changed. Someone had used correction fluid to alter dates, making it look like the legal process had been going on for months, when in reality, the papers appeared to have been created just days before the demolition. Bradley called a press conference of his own. Standing outside his small office on Main Street with David and other family members beside him, he laid out what he'd discovered. "These documents are fraudulent," he announced, holding up copies of Pinnacle's paperwork. "They contain forged signatures, altered dates, and references to legal proceedings that never took place. This family has been the victim of what appears to be an elaborate scheme to steal their property." But Pinnacle wasn't going to back down easily. Within hours of Bradley's press conference, the Henderson family found themselves under attack from Pinnacle's legal team. The corporation hired one of the most expensive law firms in the state, a group known for defending big companies against lawsuits. Their strategy was simple: make the Henderson family look like they were lying. Pinnacle's lawyers released their own statement, claiming that the Henderson family had been in financial trouble for years. They produced what they said were unpaid tax bills, overdue loan payments, and evidence of mounting debts. They suggested that William Henderson had been struggling to keep the farm running and had secretly agreed to sell the property to pay off his creditors. They painted a picture of a family that was either lying about their situation or was simply unaware of how bad their financial problems had become. They implied that the demolition was actually a relief for the Hendersons, allowing them to escape from debts they couldn't pay. The media coverage began to shift. Some news outlets started questioning whether the Henderson family was telling the whole truth. Maybe this wasn't the clear-cut case of corporate bullying that it had first appeared to be. Maybe there was more to the story. Pinnacle's lawyers also went after Tom Bradley personally. They filed complaints with the State Bar Association, claiming he was making false statements and pursuing frivolous lawsuits. They suggested he was a small-town lawyer who was in over his head, trying to make a name for himself by taking on a major corporation. The pressure was intense. David started getting phone calls at all hours, sometimes from reporters asking pointed questions about his family's finances, sometimes from people who seemed to be trying to intimidate him into dropping the case. Linda found strangers going through their mail and asking neighbors questions about the family's personal business. But the worst part was the doubt that began to creep in. When a major corporation with unlimited resources says you're wrong, when they produce official-looking documents and hire expensive lawyers to prove their point, it's hard not to wonder if maybe you're the one who's mistaken. David began to question his own memories. Had his father mentioned financial problems that David hadn't understood? Were there conversations about selling the farm that he'd forgotten or misinterpreted? When grief and shock are already clouding your judgment, it becomes easy to doubt what you thought you knew for certain. The family felt alone and overwhelmed. They were still mourning the loss of William, still trying to process the destruction of their home, and now they were being told by experts and lawyers that they were either liars or fools. Jennifer stopped talking to reporters. Michael considered going back to Colorado and letting the lawyers handle everything. Linda spent most of her time crying, unable to understand how their world had fallen apart so completely in just a few days. Even Tom Bradley began to have moments of doubt. Pinnacle's Documents looked very professional. Their lawyers were clearly experienced and their arguments were persuasive. Maybe there was something he'd missed. Maybe the Henderson family really didn't understand their own situation. But then Bradley remembered something important. In all his years of practicing law, he'd learned that when something doesn't make sense, there's usually a reason. And nothing about Pinnacle's story made sense. Why would William Henderson, who had never borrowed money against his farm in 50 years, suddenly take out a massive mortgage at age 78? Why would a man who attended every town council meeting never mention that his property was being considered for eminent domain? Why would someone who kept meticulous records of every farm expense have no documentation of the legal proceedings that Pinnacle claimed had been going on for months? The answer, Bradley suspected, was that none of it had happened the way Pinnacle claimed. But suspecting fraud and proving it were two very different things. And Pinnacle Development Corporation was counting on the fact that a small-town lawyer and a grieving family wouldn't have the resources to uncover the truth. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. 3 weeks after the demolition, Jennifer was sitting in her hotel room going through the videos she'd recorded on that terrible Saturday morning. She'd watched them dozens of times, but something kept nagging at her. There was a detail she felt like she was missing, something important hiding in plain sight. The first video showed the demolition crew arriving, their massive machines rumbling toward the farmhouse while the family was still at the cemetery. The second captured her father and brother running across the field, trying desperately to stop what was happening. But it was the third video that Jennifer kept coming back to. In this one, she'd focused on the crew supervisor as he argued with her father. The man had been so confident, so sure of himself as he waved his paperwork around. Jennifer could hear his voice clearly on the recording, explaining that he had all the proper authorization. "We got court orders, we got permits, we got everything we need," the supervisor had said, reading from his clipboard. "Property at 1247 County Road 15 is scheduled for clearing today." Jennifer paused the video and played that part again, and again. Something about the way he'd said the address bothered her, but she couldn't figure out what. Then it hit her. Their farm wasn't at 1247 County Road 15. It was at 1247 County Road 51. The supervisor had read the wrong address. Jennifer's hands were shaking as she called her father. "Dad, you need to hear this," she said, and played the recording over the phone. David listened carefully, then asked her to play it again. "Are you sure that's what he said?" "I'm positive. He said County Road 15, not 51. Dad, they demolished the wrong property." The next morning, Tom Bradley was in his office early making phone calls. If Pinnacle had paperwork for a property on County Road 15, he needed to find out what that property was and who owned it. What he discovered changed everything. There was indeed a farm at 1247 County Road 15, about 50 miles away in the next county, and that farm had been legally purchased by Pinnacle Development Corporation 6 months earlier. The owner, an elderly farmer named Robert Chang, had willingly sold his property to the company after his children moved away, and he decided he was too old to keep farming. All of Pinnacle's paperwork was legitimate. The foreclosure documents, the court orders, the permits, they were all real. But they were for the wrong property. Someone at Pinnacle had confused County Road 15 with County Road 51, and instead of demolishing the farm they actually owned, they had destroyed the Henderson place by mistake. Bradley immediately called the local news stations. "We have proof that Pinnacle Development Corporation demolished the wrong property," he announced. They had legal authority to tear down a farm 50 miles away, but instead they destroyed a family's home while the owner was being buried. But Pinnacle's lawyers weren't ready to give up. They claimed the video was unclear, that maybe the supervisor had misspoken, or that the recording had been doctored. They demanded that technical experts examine the phone video to verify its authenticity. That's when Jennifer remembered something else. During the chaos of that morning, she hadn't been the only one recording. Several other family members had pulled out their phones, and she was pretty sure her uncle had been taking pictures the whole time. More importantly, she remembered seeing a security camera on the gas station across the road from their farm. The owner, Mr. Peterson, was a friend of the family. Maybe his cameras had captured something useful. Bradley and David drove to Peterson's gas station that afternoon. Peterson had known the Henderson family for 20 years, and he was happy to help however he could. His security system recorded everything that happened in front of his store, and he still had the footage from that Saturday morning. What they saw was even better than Jennifer's phone videos. Peterson's cameras had a clear view of the road leading to the Henderson farm. The footage showed the demolition convoy arriving, but more importantly, it showed something that happened 3 days before the demolition. On Wednesday evening, 2 men in expensive suits had driven up to the Henderson property in a black luxury car. They'd gotten out, walked around the farmhouse, taken pictures, and spent about 20 minutes examining the buildings and land. Then they'd driven away. Those are Pinnacle executives, Bradley realized, recognizing one of the men from newspaper photos. They came here and looked at this specific property 3 days before the demolition. They knew exactly which farm they were targeting. The security footage proved that Pinnacle's demolition wasn't just a simple address mix-up. Company executives had personally visited the Henderson farm, planned the demolition, and then carried it out while the family was at William's funeral. But Bradley wanted more evidence. He hired a computer expert named Angela Rodriguez, who specialized in digital forensics. Rodriguez had worked with law enforcement agencies, helping them uncover evidence hidden in computers and electronic devices. If Pinnacle planned this demolition in advance, Bradley explained to Rodriguez, there should be emails, text messages, or other electronic communications about it. We need to get access to their internal communications. Through the legal discovery process, Bradley was able to force Pinnacle to turn over emails and internal documents related to the Henderson property. What Rodriguez found in those files was shocking. The first email was dated 2 weeks before William's death. It was from a Pinnacle project manager to his supervisor, explaining that there might be complications with the Henderson property because the family was well connected in the local community and might organize resistance to the demolition. My supervisor had replied, "We need to accelerate the timeline and eliminate potential complications before they can organize legal opposition." Another email, sent just days before William's funeral, discussed the window of opportunity created by the owner's death. "The family will be distracted by funeral arrangements," one executive wrote. "This is our chance to move forward before they can hire lawyers or contact the media." Most damning of all was an email sent the morning of the demolition. A Pinnacle executive had written, "Crew is in position, weather is clear, proceeding with demolition while family is occupied with burial services." Rodriguez also found deleted text messages between Pinnacle employees. One supervisor had texted his crew chief, "Make sure this gets done today while they're all at the cemetery. We don't want any drama or interference." The evidence painted a clear picture. Pinnacle Development Corporation hadn't just made an innocent mistake about addresses. They had deliberately chosen to demolish the Henderson farm during William's funeral because they thought the family would be too distracted to stop them. But there was one more piece of evidence that sealed the case. Rodriguez discovered that Pinnacle's lawyers had created some of their proof documents after the demolition had already taken place. Computer metadata showed that several files had been created or modified days after the Henderson house was destroyed. The company hadn't just demolished the wrong property by accident. When they realized their mistake, they had tried to cover it up by creating false documents and then claiming the demolition was legal all along. Bradley called another press conference, this time with boxes full of evidence. The security camera footage, the phone recordings, the internal emails, and the digital forensics report were all laid out for the media to see. Pinnacle Development Corporation didn't just make a mistake, Bradley announced. They deliberately targeted this family during their most vulnerable moment, then tried to cover up their actions with fraudulent documents. This wasn't incompetence. This was calculated corporate cruelty. The story exploded across national news. The image of a family's home being demolished during their father's funeral, while corporate executives congratulated themselves on their timing, was too outrageous for most people to ignore. Pinnacle's stock price began to fall as investors realized the company was facing not just a lawsuit, but potential criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. The executives who had sent those internal emails suddenly found themselves hiring their own personal lawyers. For the Henderson family, the evidence brought a mixture of relief and anger. Relief because they finally had proof that they weren't crazy, that their memories and instincts had been right all along. But anger because the evidence showed just how callous and calculated Pinnacle's actions had been. They hadn't just lost their home to a corporate mistake. They had been deliberately targeted by people who saw their grief as an opportunity and their funeral as convenient timing. Now it was time for those people to face the consequences of their choices. The courthouse was packed on the first day of the trial. Word had spread far beyond Nebraska's borders about the family, whose home was demolished during their father's funeral. News vans lined the street outside. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, and people who had never heard of the Henderson family before now felt personally invested in seeing justice done. David Henderson sat at the plaintiff's table, still hardly believing he was there. 6 months ago, his biggest worry had been planning his father's funeral. Now he was the lead plaintiff in what legal experts were calling one of the most shocking corporate misconduct cases in recent history. Tom Bradley had assembled a team of lawyers to help with the case. The evidence was so strong that several big city attorneys had offered to work for free, knowing that a victory against Pinnacle Development Corporation would make headlines nationwide. But Bradley remained the lead attorney, the small-town lawyer, who had believed in the Henderson family when everyone else thought they were fighting a hopeless battle. Pinnacle's legal team filled 3 tables on the other side of the courtroom. They wore expensive suits and carried briefcases that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Their strategy was clear from the opening statements: minimize the damage, claim it was all an honest mistake, and hope the jury would be sympathetic to a company that employed thousands of people. But Bradley had something more powerful than expensive lawyers. He had the truth, and he had evidence that made the truth impossible to ignore. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and every day brought new revelations that made Pinnacle look worse. The jury heard Jennifer's phone recording of the supervisor reading the wrong address. They watched the security camera footage showing Pinnacle executives visiting the Henderson farm days before the demolition. They read the internal emails discussing how to eliminate complications while the family was distracted by funeral arrangements. One of the most powerful moments came when Michael Henderson took the witness stand. He described growing up on the farm, learning to drive a tractor from his grandfather and helping with the harvest every summer even after he moved to Colorado for work. "I always planned to come back someday," he told the jury, his voice breaking slightly. "I wanted my kids to grow up the same way I did, learning the value of hard work and family land. But now, there's nothing left to come back to." The jury also heard from neighbors and community members who described what the Henderson farm had meant to the area: the annual county fair in their biggest field, the fresh vegetables donated to the food bank, the way William and Dorothy had opened their home to anyone who needed help during tough times. "They weren't just farmers," one neighbor testified. "They were the heart of our community. When Pinnacle destroyed that house, they destroyed something that can never be replaced." But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Pinnacle's own employees. The crew supervisor who had led the demolition broke down on the witness stand when Bradley played Jennifer's recording. "I just followed orders," he said, tears in his eyes. "They told me it was the right property. I never would have torn down someone's home during their father's funeral if I'd known the truth." Even more shocking was the testimony from a former Pinnacle project manager who had quit the company after learning about the Henderson case. He revealed that the company had a pattern of using aggressive tactics to acquire property, often targeting elderly landowners or families going through difficult times. "The Henderson demolition wasn't unusual," he explained. "It was just the first time they got caught. The company culture encouraged employees to find ways around legal obstacles and to move fast before property owners could organize resistance." Pinnacle's lawyers tried to argue that the executives' emails had been taken out of context, that the timing of the demolition during William's funeral was just an unfortunate coincidence. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and their explanations sounded hollow even to sympathetic listeners. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Angela Rodriguez, the digital forensics expert, presented her analysis of Pinnacle's computer files. Using charts and graphs that the jury could easily understand, she showed exactly when various documents had been created or modified. These so-called legal documents that Pinnacle claimed justified their actions, Rodriguez explained, pointing to a timeline on a large screen, were actually created after the demolition took place. The company tried to manufacture evidence to cover up their mistake. By the third week of testimony, even Pinnacle's lawyers seemed to realize their case was hopeless. They began focusing on damage control, trying to limit how much money the jury might award rather than proving their client's innocence. But the Henderson family's suffering was impossible to minimize. Jennifer described finding pieces of her grandmother's china in the rubble, broken fragments of dishes that had been in the family for generations. Linda testified about losing all of William's personal belongings, including the letters he'd written to Dorothy during their courtship. "We lost more than a house," David explained to the jury. "We lost our history, every birthday celebration, every Christmas morning, every family milestone that happened in that house. All those memories were tied to a place that doesn't exist anymore." The financial damage was easier to calculate, but no less devastating. The farmhouse and outbuildings were worth at least $300,000, but they couldn't be replaced at any price. The Henderson place wasn't just any old house. It was a piece of history, built by hand by a man who had literally dug the foundation with his own tools. When the jury retired to deliberate, nobody was sure what to expect. Corporate liability. Cases can be unpredictable, and even with overwhelming evidence, there's always a chance that a jury might be reluctant to award large damages against a major company. They were back in less than 4 hours. The foreman stood up and read the verdict. In a clear, steady voice, "We find for the plaintiffs on all counts. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $15 million for the destroyed property and structures. We award $10 million for emotional distress and loss of family heritage. And we award punitive damages in the amount of $15 million, designed to ensure that Pinnacle Development Corporation never again targets grieving families for corporate profit. $40 million total." The courtroom erupted in cheers. David Henderson collapsed into his chair, overwhelmed by relief and disbelief. Jennifer hugged her father, both of them crying for the first time since William's funeral. But these were tears of joy, not grief. Tom Bradley, the small-town lawyer who had taken on a corporate giant, was surrounded by reporters asking how it felt to win such a massive victory. "This was never about the money," he said. "This was about proving that regular families can fight back when powerful companies think they can do whatever they want." But the legal victory was just the beginning of the consequences for Pinnacle Development Corporation. The FBI launched a criminal investigation based on the evidence uncovered during the trial. 3 Pinnacle executives were eventually charged with fraud, conspiracy, and document falsification. 2 of them served time in federal prison, and all 3 were banned from working in real estate development. The company's stock price never recovered from the scandal. Within 2 years, Pinnacle Development Corporation had filed for bankruptcy, its reputation destroyed by the image of bulldozers tearing down a family home while the owner was being buried. More importantly, the Henderson case sparked nationwide changes in property development law. Congress passed the Family Property Protection Act, requiring companies to provide 30 days written notice before any demolition of residential property. The law also established a victim compensation fund for families who lose their homes to corporate misconduct. Several states passed even stronger protections, making it a felony to deliberately target families during funerals, medical emergencies, or other times of crisis. The Henderson case became a standard example in law schools, teaching future lawyers about corporate responsibility and the importance of protecting individual property rights. For the Henderson family, the money allowed them to rebuild their lives in ways they never could have imagined. They used part of the settlement to purchase a similar historical farm about 20 miles away, a place where Michael could bring his children to learn about their heritage. They donated $5 million to establish the William Henderson Foundation, which provides legal assistance to rural families facing corporate land grabs. Jennifer left her job in Chicago to run the foundation full-time, carrying on her grandfather's legacy of helping others. Most importantly, they had proven that even the most powerful corporations couldn't escape justice when they chose greed over basic human decency. The case that began with the destruction of a farmhouse during a funeral ended with new laws protecting families across the country. William Henderson never got to see his great-grandchildren grow up on the family farm. But thanks to his family's courage in fighting back against impossible odds, thousands of other families would be protected from ever experiencing the same devastating loss. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it can change everything.